language examples would be HIV and hepatitis B, both of which we think came from primates, from apes, from chimpanzees, and came across that species barrier.
In the 70s and the 80s, the world was faced by the emergence of a whole range of interesting, exotic, new, so-called new infections like Ebola, Lassa fever, Legionnaire's disease, Marburg's disease, the resurgence of Lyme disease and the like. And suddenly the game changed in some ways. Suddenly people now began to talk about no longer the decline of infectious disease, but the re-emergence of infectious disease and the emergence of so-called new infections.
In Hong Kong and other Asian cities, SARS has had another effect that has nothing to do with the medical epidemic.
We're seeing not one epidemic here, but two. There's one epidemic that involves cases and deaths in a restricted time frame. The other epidemic is an epidemic of reaction, fear, panic, hysteria and paranoia, which far threatens to overwhelm the other epidemic. The extent of fear and the extent of panic, the extent of people fleeing from the epidemic.
A good 80% of the people on the street are wearing face masks now, considering that you really only have to wear them if you're ill to prevent it from spreading. I'm assuming that 80% of the people aren't ill, so a large portion are just doing it because they're afraid. You look at a person driving a car with their windows up. They're wearing a mask. I guess they're afraid of catching it from the radio.
As each new victim contracts the disease, it's reported on the nightly news. SARS has become the first new disease to be tracked in real time round the world, heightening the economic panic.
All of a sudden, SARS hit. There's not one company in Hong Kong that isn't affected. The problem is even worse because most companies in Hong Kong are small and medium-sized enterprises. I think in the next month or two, you're going to have an unprecedented flood of bankruptcies. There's no one in the restaurants. It's wherever you go. From the time when you arrive in Hong Kong on an airplane and you find that it's empty now, whereas a month ago, you couldn't get a seat. You go into a hotel, you have 7%, 8%, 9% occupancy from a place that's used to 90% occupancy. There's 7 million people in Hong Kong. Of the 7 million people now, we have fewer than 2,000 people who have caught it. So the percentages of getting it are very small, but that doesn't stop people from being afraid about it. I think that the real damage has to do with panic, the economy. That's affecting everybody.
Doctors and scientists are trying to dampen down the panic that's been generated. They point to the low contagious nature of SARS compared to other diseases and to the relatively low death rate of 6%.
If you look at the number of deaths associated with pneumonia in Hong Kong this last month, compared to the number of deaths associated with pneumonia last year, the same month, it's a bit higher, but it's not 5-fold or 10-fold or 20-fold higher. So I think you have to keep things in proportion. I mean, if it is going to remain with us, it will be another cause of pneumonia. That's bad news, but it's not the end of the world.
Influenza is highly contagious. You know, the outbreaks are normally explosive. You just pick it up by sitting next to someone. You know, it's explosive, explosive, explosive. Compared to that, the virus causing the present SARS outbreak, as we see it at the moment, looks much, much less infectious. And I'm saying that because many of the cases, if not most of the cases, have been restricted to people in families, you know, where you're in very close contact with each other. Cases in hospitals, again, where people are in very close contact with each other, and in hotels. And that's the classic signal that a virus of fairly low infectiousness gives, that it can spread under particular circumstances, but does not have the beef, the oomph, to explode out into the great wider community.
But scientists and doctors also know that it could be more than a year before there is a vaccine. Until then, the only way to stop the spread is rapid diagnosis followed by quarantine.
I think SARS is just one example of emerging infections, and I believe there will be more. I believe that the next 10 years or so will see a substantial period of infectious disease in the world. Partly this is due to the globalization and the interconnectedness of the world. It's also due to the fact that we continue to modify the environment and we continue to intrude on natural disease systems. I believe that we will see a lot more new, in inverted commas, infections over the next 10 years or so.
China, the world's largest country, is struggling to contain the SARS outbreak. If a super spreader like Professor Liu arrived in Britain, would our nation be able to contain SARS?